All right. So thank you again, Joe. As you said, my name is Silas Cutler. I am a reverse engineer. Some of you may know me from my previous work while I was at Google, Chronicle. I'm actually back working for CrowdStrike, enjoying my life back doing hacking and malware samples all day. So hold on. I want to make sure I have my speaker notes up as well. There we go. Okay. So this is my first time doing a talk of this style. Traditionally, I've done talks that are generally fairly technically focused. Things about tools, malware families, things like that. So this is my first time doing this type of talk. And in that spirit, I've decided to try and make it fairly personal and talk about some things that are fairly important to me. So I've titled this My Oppenheimer Paradox and Responsibility for the Things I Create. So to kick it off, for those of you unfamiliar, Julius Robert Oppenheimer was one of the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project, and he's sort of credited as the founder, or the father of the atomic bomb. And most notably, it was during the Trinity nuclear test, which was the first test of the atomic bomb. He was quoted in saying, "Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." And what's interesting is, sadly, over the years, this has kind of become a Pinterest equivalent of a motivational poster, and it's unfortunately lost a little bit of its original meaning. So I want to go back and talk a little bit about that. So Oppenheimer in this quote was actually quoting the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, and it's really interesting. And unfortunately, my Western views and not being able to read Hindu rather limit my ability to understand it a bit, but it's interesting because the scripture he quoted is about the god Vishnu trying to convince a prince to do his duty. And as the first bomb was tested and Oppenheimer watched, it was distinctly a changing moment in his life. He knew the world would never be the same as everybody else did that day. And so the reason I bring this up, and the reason I like to think about this, is we're in a very strange industry, and it's a very special industry because inherently we're all working towards a very common goal, regardless of who we work for, regardless of what area of security. It always feels like we're all working towards something. And I've worked with reverse engineers in China. I've worked with people in Iran, and they all are all also working towards this sort of common goal. And while I want to keep it vague, inherently we're all trying to make the world more secure. There's variations on what that actually looks like, and there's minor changes, but inherently it all kind of comes to making the world secure. And the real kind of difference is that we kind of differ on how we get there. Not so much what it looks like is generally pretty similar, but it's always the how. What things move us along faster, what things slow us down. And the how is really where we run into friction. So the how is always highly subjective in this as well. There's some folks who stand distinctly on the view that pen testing and more tools and more things to help find security bugs is the way to secure the future. There's those who go back to an area that sadly is often forgotten, which is that working with developers and building better coding practices will reduce attack surface and things like that. And then there's groups like law enforcement who are listening to these academic debates, just looking to put handcuffs on people who are bad actors and causing harm. So the thing is though, even as we have these academic debates, how changes and evolves. So I was thinking about something kind of heavy the other day, which was, what if Metasploit was released today? And what if Metasploit Metasploit was originally first developed and released in 2003, but what if the entire toolkit in its current inception was released today? What tools wouldn't we have? What tools would we have? And as I mulled this over, I realized that that if something like that was dropped today, we would all be scrambling to build tools, to build detections and build countermeasures. And so I've started to appreciate a little more heavily that that even though we disagree on the how, it's together slowly that we tune and adjust the course moving forward. And again, still slowly and together. Oh, wrong direction. So, so coming back to my original statement, which is that inherently we're all working towards a common goal and just differ on how. The how we differ is what's good, and through the new perspectives and through new ideas, we all get better and we all get better together. But more so, the community that we're in is also exceptionally unique and exceptionally special because of what is generally an individual's ability to influence. Individually, we can create huge amounts of influence. And I think about people like HD Moore with the Metasploit project, where what start off as sort of like individual projects massively open up and become rallying posts for members of the community. And how the community is so open and welcoming to people in a lot of different views, backgrounds, and disciplines. And I think even things like DEF CON, where there's really this collision of computer nerds, punk, and so many other different things all in one rather special place. And the most important reason I'm bringing this up is because inherently it's a very fragile system. It is delicate. It is something that requires care, because sometimes when we have radically new things and when there are new ideas, they can be both positive, but they also can be highly destructive as well. So crisis has changed things fast. And I think no better example of this is somebody like Malware Tech Blog or Marcus Hutchinson, where he spent years, and I knew him from prior, working on tracking things like Mirai. And when WannaCry hit and he grabbed the domain, he absolutely took off with it. But unfortunately, it had that unfortunate backlash of his past catching up with him in some things as well. But I'll say I've always had a very strong passion and a deep enjoyment for when there are these large scale outbreaks or crises, because they break things down fast. They change things, and they help us see problems. And I'll come back to it in a little bit on some more of my thoughts. But inevitably, with these things, is always the in response to NotPetya. The attack showed us after WannaCry, the lessons learned, and we all move forward. So, so kind of the crux of this is I have a fun story that I want to tell that I didn't think I'd ever actually tell. So I'm calling this sort of how to create a crisis 101. So some of you may know, for many years I've been involved in an event called Northeast Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition. It's often called a red team, blue team exercise, but unfortunately that's not correctly the right term. It is a blue team exercise between students. Their team simply acts as a tool for the organizers and an agent of chaos surrounding the whole event. I've been doing this for 7 to 8 years. After my first year, when I socially engineered my way onto the red team in my last year of school. The event works by having students dropped into a relatively unknown network. Sometimes they have some loose documentation that they may have gotten a few days before. And for the weekend, they need to defend their network against the red team, keep business critical services online, and also do some general IT related work that comes along with that. And the red team is made up of volunteer industry professionals, some of whom are professional pen testers, some of whom who are developers, and even some people who are malware analysts like myself. And what's kind of special about this event is it's not just designed to test sort of like technical abilities. It's not a CTF event, but it also pulls in and requires a bit of testing of people's professionalism and how people act under pressure as well. So I like to often describe it as one part Kobayashi Maru for people who are fans of Star Trek, which is essentially an unwinnable scenario designed to test how you respond and to designed to test how you react when you're afraid. And I note that as well because it's not necessarily always teams that win that are extremely successful. So I've hired someone actually directly from this event. His team, I think, came into second to last, but while watching some of his hands on keyboard and the things he was doing as a defender, um, he had the skill set that I was looking for, and I tried to hire him right immediately during the event from it. Um, and then the other part of the event is generally like the IT crowd. Students have to do traditional IT related tasks such as reset passwords, the have you turned it off and turn it back on again, and we do try and keep the event a little bit lighthearted in times. So I remember um, printing up pictures of like My Little Pony after students had to set up a network printer and things like that. So a few years ago in 2017, as a red team, we decided that we wanted to up the real factor. Um, what could we do that would make the event more relevant to students? Having students use things like Windows XP systems that you can MSO 8067 point shoot remote command execution. That's not super real. But how can we up the realism factor? So we started playing with some different ideas. We could simulate a DDoS attack. Mirai had come out a few months before, but it's risky. You could damage the infrastructure of the event, and people get upset with that. So we kind of ruled that out. We started thinking about what happens if we just suddenly took a couple of the computers of the teams. But I think we already do that actually. Then we started thinking, well, what happens if we just started taking some of the students from each team for an hour or two? I think we do that too. So we started getting a little further and be like, well, what if we started intentionally creating vulnerabilities in their software? Like modify the version of SSH that comes with their system so that it accepts a hard-coded password. We've done things like that in the past, but the problem is when we went back and we're thinking about what we did, is a lot of times those really carefully crafted backdoors get overwritten when somebody does like apt update, or just through the cycling of things. So we kept thinking about it, and we started thinking about, well, what would happen if we tried to replay like a recent attack? Like, has there been anything new going on? Are there any big stories? Like Mirai would be something, but unfortunately, with 30 computers in a lab, we're not going to get quite the level of DDoS that would make this exciting. So, started thinking about it. It seemed like a good idea. So we needed something. We just needed that case that we could latch onto, something that would be still within our reach, but something that would be novel and interesting. And then we had the idea, which was, what if we replicated the Shamoon attack? It's one of these really rare pieces of malware. It had resurfaced back in November. It just happened, there had been another attack in January as well, so it was highly relevant. It's a hot topic. The malware's not so sophisticated. Would this be possible? So for people unfamiliar with Shamoon, it's also called Distrack. I prefer to call it Shamoon. It's a destructive malware, overwrites files on an infected system. It overwrites the files with an image, which I'll talk briefly about later. Suspected of being from Iran, mainly it's targeted Saudi Arabia. These details are also subjective to when we were analyzing this as well. So things have changed over the years. But what's unusual also about Shamoon is that, in my opinion, one of the things that I find that makes it really special is, in some way, Shamoon is my buzzword bingo malware. So I love walking around places like RSA and Black Hat where they talk about things like cyber time bomb and cyber Pearl Harbor. And unfortunately, the thing is Shamoon hits almost every one of those checkboxes. It's one of those pieces of malware that resurfaces briefly and then disappears for a long period of time. And the other thing as well is the whole cyber time bomb, where within the malware there's a function that waits for a specific time and then triggers. Shamoon has that too. But the thing about Shamoon that makes it more than just buzzword bingo is that it actually delivers on this. So when it was first used in 2012, it wiped 35,000 systems in Saudi Aramco. That is a huge number and a really big head trip. And so the thing also with Shamoon as well is it's not so terribly sophisticated. So when I've done small malware analysis training courses, I oftentimes like to use point of sale malware because it's relatively technically simple. But Shamoon is another really great case for it because it blends two really really interesting things. It blends both technical low sophistication, but with novel techniques and things as well. The string obfuscation isn't terribly hard, and it provides a really rich, interesting thing to analyze while still being relatively simple. And within the Shamoon, it does more than just destroying systems. It also has the ability to sort of self-replicate across a network, and it does this through hard-coded passwords and some other things using remote registry and net use. Um, Unfortunately, the actors, when this has been used in the wild, haven't, or at least in 2016, didn't use the network functionality and some of the C2 abilities. And there was also a lot of things that were never really used by the malware. So, like, theoretically, it could also have been used for ransomware based on hard-coded RSA key. So it's a rather fun quandary of a malware to look at. So as we were thinking about it, we started thinking more and more that this was something that could be done. So when we were thinking about it, there was a couple things we were taking into consideration. What we wanted was something that would be preventable also, because inherently our job is we're not trying to beat the students. We're not trying to pull one over on them. We do want them to be able to prevent these things. We want them to be able to defend themselves. But we also want something that's current and topical, something that matters, and something that's interesting. Additionally, there's some teams that have played for years that they're very, very, very talented at playing the game as well. They're very talented students in general, but they know how the game works. And so there's some students that do things like Friday, pull the cable at the very beginning of the event to try and block us from getting access. So we wanted something that would be able to potentially slip past this as well. Additionally, this is also a relatively new thing that we hadn't done on the red team. We've done things like use Cobalt Strike to emulate different protocols, so our malware might look like something else, but to actually use the malware, that was different. Yeah, okay, so we started thinking about what would replication look like? What would it actually require to do this? So the first is tooling. I'd spent enough time reversing Shamoon that I was comfortable enough where I could say there wouldn't be any sort of surprises if we were to use it. I had run through every single function that I could possibly find. I'd spent weeks and days and weeks hunting through this, labeling every single function I could. C2 protocol was easy, so all we'd have to do is essentially overwrite the original quad 1 C2 address they'd put in, and we could use it to sort of keep track of how many infections we were seeing and some things like that. And we'd also know roughly like what teams might get hit by it once it got closer to the trigger date. So we started thinking about procedures. Could we recreate the same steps the actor used in their attacks? So unfortunately, this wasn't as possible. So how the actor structured when the wiping would occur and some of those deep theories of how the operator conducted their operations wouldn't necessarily work as well for this event. We wouldn't want the malware to start wiping systems when the students were away in the evenings because that wouldn't be fair. But if it was something that could hit midday, we could get close. We also, in the end, could use the same deployment scripts because they're just batch files and run those across the networks and do it before the event as well, so we can make sure every team evenly got hit. So we were close. And then the last thing was control. Because this was essentially, tool replication, and this was current, and we didn't want to accidentally have something happen that was outside of our control. What can we do to ensure that this doesn't impact real world research? Easy enough. We control the environment. We're working with the organizers of the event. We can make sure things like virus total, malshare, hybrid analysis, make sure they're blocked that way. And also students can't take things out of the event. So that way we can sort of control the distribution of the sample. So everything was moving right along, and everything was definitely making sense. So planned outcome. So it's important to remember also that this was pre-WannaCry and pre the sort of modern ransomware era. I'd say it'd be pretty rare for students at that time to say that they've ever experienced a ransomware or a wiper attack. So there was a lot of interesting questions that I also had just out of my own curiosity, which is, in the event that this works or we do this, what would be their strategy for pulling themselves back up? What services would they think that would be the first things to come up? What would their first actions be? And what would that thought process look like for people in that situation? And students are a really great model for this because they're thinking about it already. And in this case, they're also expecting to have attacks and expecting to lose services. So I was really curious to know how this would go. And additionally, the other thing as well, and I mentioned this briefly before, is that there are teams that have been playing for years and they know how to game the system a bit. Um, in I'd say the 2013, 2014 timeframe, when a lot of the teams had, Windows Server 2003 and Windows XP systems, the first 3 to 4 hours of the event was a bloodbath. There's actually commits in the Metasploit history for when we found that it was possible to exceed the number of possible shells that Metasploit could handle. So because of this, we wanted to make sure that with this attack, we pre-stage, pre-plan everything. That way, we're not reliant upon that 3 to 4 hour initial salvo to do this. So we could build it in also to the sort of like narrative of the event, and see how it goes. So with all the entities involved in the event in agreement about this, I started work on the process of figuring out if this was technically possible to do. So I've broken my head the entire malware down into a couple parts, and this is the screenshot from my initial description of the malware. So Shamoon is generally considered modular because there's several different components. It has an initial dropper, which drops a wiper module and a network module. If running on a 64-bit system, it drops another dropper of itself with 64-bit versions of the wiper and network module. But for simplicity's sake, we're just going to combine these into dropper, wiper, and network components. So there's a lot of things that I knew off the bat had to be changed. I wanted it to still be able to spread. So the default credentials from all the team systems, made sure to plug those in. That's an easy change. The trigger date, we don't want this going off before the event starts. So we set it, and there was a bit of debate on when we would actually trigger this because we didn't want it going off too early in the event. We didn't want it going off too late. And the wiper component has a problem. Wiper component in the image that was used in the 2016 variant was a picture of a deceased Syrian refugee named Alan Kurdi. Like I said, I've spent a lot of time looking at the Shamoon malware. I think about Alan probably every other day. So I did not include that picture in these slides because, yes. So network module has quad 1 configured as the initial C2 server from when the actor used it. This was likely just because, not sure. It's up to your analytic judgment of why they didn't use it. It's possible they didn't need control at that time, or they worried about the control, a control vector becoming a detection point in which they could lose access or preemptively trigger the alert to vendors. So these were all the things that needed to be done initially. But before I sort of like was confident that this would be ready to go, I slapped a warning banner into every single piece. Something that just said, this is for an academic event. If you see this, here's an email to contact, just in case. So everything seemed ready. So we slammed that button to go. So these are the next two slides are things that I've never shown really anyone outside of the red team from the event. So this is the Shamoon control that I built. This is not the actor one. This is one I built for the event. So competition starts, and we get set up on the network, and the sort of initial waiting begins. And it's a very, very funny thing where there's that moment where you're waiting for the shells to connect back, and you're not sure if you've done everything correct. You tested everything, but there's that moment of like both like panic and excitement where you wait for shells to connect back, and then they start connecting back. So all the hard work of setting this up, building this, planning it, preparing it, ready to go. So now we were seeing connections from the infected systems on the student systems, which started spreading to other systems on the student networks. And then all that was left really at this point is to watch and see which teams found it, and which didn't, and then wait for that trigger date. And then shit hit the fan, and it hit the fan hard. So about halfway through the first day, and the first day was Friday. Halfway through the first day, samples hit on VT for it. VT was originally planned to be blocked. We'd worked with the other organizers to make sure these things were blocked. Maybe it had, I don't know at this point. In the end, I found out that the samples had been auto-uploaded by a system internals tool. Regardless of if that was through Microsoft or some system, I don't know, shit hit the fan. So these got uploaded to VirusTotal. And once these were uploaded, the response was almost immediate. My phone started ringing. I notified a few folks ahead of time at other security companies and around, just saying, hey, if you see Shamoon this weekend, it's highly unlikely the actor. And we gave them some notice, like just check the last 10, 24 bytes of the samples. Like if you see something, it's me. But shit hit the fan because these hit VT. So the immediate fallout, almost immediately there were several bad hot takes that started, and bad misinformation. So immediately after this, I had to leave the event because I couldn't get my email to work properly because the network was supposed to be locked down, and I wasn't able to effectively talk externally to make sure that things were handled. So I passed off responsibility to another guy on the team for local stuff, and we basically spent the entire weekend talking to each other on the phone, handling things between the event and me trying to make sure externally that this didn't become a huge story. So I basically drove 6 hours that night to get home. But from things I started hearing from folks still at the event and externally, I started hearing things like, oh, the malware started externally spreading, or the malware started spreading to other university systems, both of which were just bad hot takes and not actually accurate. As like I controlled the C2 server and was seeing where things were coming, like seeing infections, nothing happened outside of that lab network. There was no external spreading, just bad hot takes. Unfortunately, Saudi Arabia reportedly also got notification late and treated it like an emergency, which was really unfortunate. And if anybody from Saudi Arabia cert or was impacted by that, I'm sorry, I owe you a beer. But just bad immediate hot takes. So slightly longer fallout of things. We did a bit of soul searching as a red team as well. We kind of went back and started saying, did we ever stop to think if we should? And in a delusion of grandeur type state to compare ourselves to the Manhattan Project, did we move too fast and did we not think things through? And unfortunately, where we kind of ended was best of intentions ended up with the worst of results. So we've generally had now a loose ban on future replaying of Tool. And it's been a topic I haven't wanted to talk about for years because it's unfortunate. It could have been a lot. It could have gone better. I've also had a request as well by some students to open source the software. And yeah, I feel like Hidden Terror was a great example of why things like that are not a great idea. Just because I don't want it being more of a model for how to do this. Longer fallout of things. There's been rather limited public reporting of this. There's folks that are aware. I'm not sure if this is just because people missed it or are really awesome to me and not wanting to dox me over it. So either way, I appreciate it. But in the end, students had a really unique experience. It was several teams did get hit fairly hard by it. One team had migrated all of their Linux workstations to Windows VMs, all of which got infected. But as we'd planned with the organizers, once it hit, recovery systems were basically wheeled into their office so they could keep playing, and did continue to get a good experience out of it. But one of the things as well that I've also worried about is it could have been, and maybe, a lot worse. And I worry sometimes that I might not know. So if you followed previous public theory on how false flag operations could look, such as the Virus Bulletin report from Brian Bartholomew and Juan Andres Correa entitled "Wave Your False Flags," they talk a lot about false flag campaigns and misattribution elements that could be used as part of it. But one of the things I feel like they didn't cover as much as the use of malware replay as potentially a false flag operation. And as I've thought a lot about it, the potential uses for this type of thing as part of a false flag are exceptionally high. With Shamoon, though, in particular, it's not terribly technically sophisticated, but the more sophisticated the malware is, the more difficult it would potentially be to detect if it was false flag. And there's minor trivial things from my variant of the malware that could be used to detect it. Obviously, something like my warning banner in it, but looking at identical timestamps of previous samples, dead data chunks in it, and things like that could distinctly tip off that that the sample had been modified after the actor, essentially. But it's also something I feel heavily responsible for. It's something I haven't wanted to see proliferate further, and I don't want to make my job harder and make attribution more difficult. So, so I'm getting pretty close to the end on this. So why this matters, and the reason I tell this story is that it's important to continuously be thinking about the consequences and what our actions and the results of our actions. Good intentions don't always equal good outcomes. And this one really produced a very bad outcome. And past actions don't always ensure good future results. And especially in this, I feel like we were caught up in the moment of the can we do this, and not enough of the. And I'll actually change from how I have this on the slide. I think we were caught up in the can we do this, but we failed in ensuring that we had the proper operational constraints in order to do this to the degree that was required to do it safely. And I've also thought about now, while I haven't considered making the tools available, it has been interesting to evaluate over time how open source, if I had open sourced it back then versus if it had been open source now, what type of impact it would have. And at this point, with things like the driver, I think now finally being revoked and some of the techniques in it no longer working, the risk and the damage of something like this being open source is significantly less. Still not something that I think should be done. But so in summary, we all share responsibility for the future, and the individual capability we have in this industry is something that we need to treat with the gravity that it deserves, and to own and evaluate all of our actions continuously as we go forward. And I mentioned at the very in the middle of that, and I may have slipped this as incorrectly said it, but I truly love crisis events, and I don't mean that in the in like a dark way. I mean that as in I enjoy crisis events and crises because I like to look at them as tests. They help us understand what worked, what can we do better, what can we do to prevent these types of things in the future. And most importantly, I really enjoy these situations because they help me see paths forward and ways to make the world better in things, because inherently you can't come to solutions without problems. You need problems because problems are paths forward. And in these crisis situations, the paths forward become much more apparent. And I remember back when Mirai hit, sitting in a Slack groups with people, just immediately dropping indicators like, here's this is a new address, this is a new C2 server, and seeing how in those moments, those things that we learn and those people that we meet build into larger relationships that in the future become bigger and stronger things that become long-lasting solutions for the community as we go forward. So I guess in summary, the thing I love most about crisis events is that they always fill me with a distinct sense of hope. And especially in this community, there's no shortage of passionate people. And when bad things happen, people come out of the woodwork and immediately step up. Cloak and daggers get left at home, and that's something I hope we truly never lose in this community. So, all right. And I will hand it back to Joe with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Silas. It was really interesting and a really cool perspective on things. So we've got a couple of minutes. We got Ryan and Thomas who are getting ready to come up next. If they want to get prepped or whatever in terms of screening. In the meantime, if there's any questions, looks like we've got some really good comments and some suggestions here or whatever, including from JD Worker, we'll be talking tomorrow. Please post them while we're getting ready for the next set.